Let's move then to talking about some things going on in Russia and some things happening with the Orthodox Church. Specifically talking about the reign of Peter the Great. Peter was born in 1672 to the imperial family. So his father was the Tsar. When his father died, Peter became joint Tsar with his half-brother. And this took place in 1682. So very young, his brother was older. But during his young adulthood, even though he is kind of Tsar, he would hold these drinking parties. And during these parties, he and his friends would engage in all sorts of practices that were essentially mocking the Orthodox Church. And so he would appoint people as bishops during the parties, and they would essentially get drunk observing communion or observing the sacrament. And so these were kind of very raucous parties, all in a way of making fun of the church. And it wasn't something that was private, it was well known, and so several of the bishops, of course, kind of went to Peter and said, hey, you're the Tsar, you can't act like this, right? This is not appropriate behavior. Peter's half-brother died in 1696, and to consolidate his power, he forced his half-sister his half-sister Sophia, who was also kind of in the mix there as well for leadership, he forced her into becoming a nun. Sent her to a convent in order to he was going to be the sole ruler in Russia. Because of Peter's experiences, he had spent a lot of time in Europe. And one of the things he wanted to see occur as Tsar was for Russia to modernize. He felt like there were a lot of things that Europe had kind of come into the 18th century, so to speak, and Russia was still behind. And this was in a variety of things. This was clothing, was habits, was manners. And so he enacts a variety of pieces of legislation, a variety of policies to attempt to bring Russia into the modern period. Many of the bishops in the Russian Orthodox Church, and even the Patriarch of Moscow, did not like a lot of what Peter was trying to push forward. Some of it because they just didn't like the policies, but also because of some of the things he was wanting to do with the church. And so this kind of struggle between traditionalism and modernism continued to foment within Russia. I mean, it was obviously there were some things religiously, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, but it was like wearing suits, right? Peter wanted to wear a suit like the European monarchs did, instead of the robes and some of the other things that the Tsars wore. He wanted to shave off his beard, which was something that a lot of Russian bishops were opposed to. And other things as well. Adopt the Western calendar, follow their New Year instead of some of the things that were traditional in Russia. The Patriarch of Moscow died in 1700, and over the next 20 years, Peter enacted a variety of policies that gradually decreased the power of the church. And so he is moving the church away from the kind of political power and cultural power that the Russian Orthodox Church had enjoyed. A lot of this is Peter being influenced by Protestantism and the state church concept in Europe. Because in a lot of the state churches, in England, Sweden, other places like that, the head of state often wielded a lot of power in the church. The head of state was often the head of the church, at least in name. The other thing that was problematic for Peter's decisions that offended a lot of Orthodox in Russia was that he looked upon a lot of the other forms of Christianity in Europe as true forms of Christianity. But they were true in their regions. So Lutheranism was great for Germany. Anglicanism was great for England. In Russia, it was Orthodoxy. Now, on the one hand, that might kind of seem, okay, why would people have a problem with that? Well, from the Orthodox mindset, they see themselves as continuing the line of the true church, right, the apostolic church, and would look at Catholicism especially, but some of these other Protestant groups as well, as departing from those truths. So how can we recognize them as true forms of Christianity? In 1721, Peter abolishes the Moscow Patriarchy. There was going to be no more Patriarch of Moscow, and places the Russian Orthodox Church under imperial control. He makes himself the head of the church. Several of the bishops complained, and he removes them from their positions as well. Excuse me, I was right on this. It's 1701 that he abolishes the Patriarch. So this opposition that he faces, he simply maneuvers people out of their positions. In 1718, a conspiracy develops to release Peter's first wife from the convent he had forced her into. Right? So he'd forced his sister into becoming a nun. He wants to divorce his first wife, and so he kind of forces her into a convent as well. And so here's this conspiracy saying, let's release his first wife. He had gotten married again. We'll take their son, we'll make him the czar, and get rid of some of these things that Peter's been doing. Peter, of course, doesn't have very much favor with this, as he gradually finds out. And so he begins an inquisition, in a sense, to find out who are the conspirators involved in this. And would often use torture against people accused of being part of the conspiracy, including his son, who he doesn't really care for, who actually dies in the process of torture. Others, including several of the clergy, are sentenced to death as well. Peter eventually finds a bishop who is quite favorable to his policies, a lot of the things that he's supporting, and he's able to use this bishop to create all sorts of writings that justify what Peter is doing. And so he finally finds a bishop who will agree with him. He establishes a council to replace the patriarchate, and so he changes some things there. But in that, he requires an oath of allegiance, which gives him a lot of power over the church. Right? So bishops kind of have to swear that they'll obey the patriarch. In the midst of all this, he encourages the publication of a variety of documents meant to educate people on the doctrines of the Russian Orthodox Church, because he thinks of the common people as relying too much on ritual for their faith, instead of the basic beliefs and doctrines. And so again, there's that influence of Protestantism. And so he thinks the Russian Orthodox people are, they're singing, they're lighting candles, they're venerating icons, right? They're respecting these pictures of the saints, and that's what they think is going to get them in good with God, but they don't know the doctrines, the truths of orthodoxy. So he tries to convince people to know this more intellectual exploration of the religion. He also has a lot of problems with monasticism, the monks, because largely the monks are the people imposing him. And so he passes a decree that no one could become a monk unless they were at least 50 years old. And figuring that these older people will, before they even get to 50, decide monasticism isn't the life for them. And so you won't have to worry about the monks. Eventually, he does allow other forms of Christianity, other churches, to form in Russia, including Catholics and Protestants. But there were some Muslim mosques as well as some Jewish synagogues as well in Peter's Russia. He died in 1725, and after his death, some of his policies remained. The patriarchy, for example, was abolished for quite a while. But some of those other policies kind of went back to what they were. So not all of the things last. For the next 40 years, Russia was ruled by three empresses, Tsaritsas, starting with Peter's wife. Eventually, however, Catherine II, carries out a coup and took over the throne. This Catherine was German. And so there is some resistance from the Russians because she is essentially a foreigner. She overthrows her husband, Peter III, who was the nephew of the previous empress. And shortly after overthrowing him, has him murdered. So obviously, the appellation the Great isn't necessarily a moral position, but she was somebody who grabbed a lot of power, was very interested in political maneuvering. And largely her commitment to Russian Orthodoxy is a political maneuver rather than a personal faith. Largely she feels, that if she remains Orthodox, at least publicly, that will hold the people to her because the people are committed to the church. But privately, she's highly influenced by the thinking of the Western Enlightenment, especially people like Voltaire. And we'll talk about the Enlightenment on Wednesday, but these are people who are moving away from religion in its traditional form and emphasizing reason. And much like Voltaire, Catherine herself isn't that interested or that supportive of religion personally. So she goes to the services, she meets with bishops, she does all these kind of things publicly, but it's only a political maneuver for power. But some of her policies do have some positive impact, we could say. She tries to stop persecution of the old believers. We talked about them in the 17th century. This kind of break-off group that didn't want to follow some of the modern policies of the 17th century patriarch. And so the persecution that they were facing ceases or diminishes under Catherine. She encouraged the freedom of religion. And she tried to bring some other reforms to the church. But, on the other hand, she also confiscates a lot of church properties and places them under imperial control, largely to get the finances that were coming from those lands. And these are lands that are worked by serfs, and so they're growing things, they've got livestock, there's all sorts of ways in which these lands produce money. Well, it was money that was going to the church, to the bishops, to the church leaders. And so she takes over these lands, and so the money now goes into the imperial coffers. Intentionally or not, Catherine makes a variety of appointments, appointing different people to different positions within the church and in her government, that largely lead to the government becoming very secular. And this is a standard thing we'll see throughout the 18th century, is this rise in governments becoming more and more separated from the church. Because of that, a lot of people point to the 18th century, especially the latter part we're talking about. Catherine reigned for quite a long time, as a time of spiritual decay in Russian Orthodoxy, largely because of her policies. Her son succeeds her as czar. She dies in the late 1700s. He becomes czar for just a few years at the end of the 18th century. He's much more religious. But, he makes even more grandiose claims than Catherine does in some ways, claiming he was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, Peter had kind of done that, but it wasn't like he had come out and said, I'm the head of the Orthodox Church. He had just kind of done that through his policies. But Catherine's son is much more prominent in that. Questions about Russia? So we kind of see this, this secularization, the Orthodox Church that had been kind of the last bastion of Eastern Orthodoxy, having a relationship with the state, that's kind of starting to break apart now as well. Let's turn from Europe and Asia now to thinking about some things going on in North America. Now, in talking about the 7 Years' War, there are a lot of things going on in Europe as well. The 7 Years' War was a war that took place in a variety of fronts. In 1754, Britain and France have a variety of military conflicts between their colonies in North America. And so often the American wing of the 7 Years' War is often referred to as the French and Indian War. Because of, that sounds like the French and Indians were fighting, but it's not. It's the British fighting the French and their Indian allies. And so things are going on in the American theater. In 1756, kind of connected with that, hostilities break out between Prussia and Austria over the control of the Holy Roman Empire. And so, and Britain and France get involved in that on opposite sides. So the 7 Years' War is happening all throughout a lot of these colonial and national powers. In the end, Britain gets control of New France, Canada. They also got Spanish Florida and India as a part of the Treaty of Paris. And so France had been under the control, Canada had been under the control of the French, now it becomes British. Florida had been under the control of the Spanish. The Spanish had sided with the Austrians, and they were on the losing side, so Florida goes to them as well. Britain renames the region around the St. Lawrence River as Quebec. And so that's where the name Quebec comes from, because this is a sizable part of the area. Canadians who did not leave became British subjects. So it's kind of like you have the opportunity to leave. If you don't want to be under British control, you don't leave, you're following the Queen. Or the King, I'm sorry. To hold public office, especially in Quebec, people had to swear allegiance to the King of England, which also included giving up their Catholicism. That doesn't settle the things, though. Amid growing concerns that French Canadians would side with those restless colonists to the south, Britain decides to pass what's known as the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act is often referred to as one of the 5 intolerable acts that lead to the Revolution. Essentially, the Quebec Act did a couple of things. First of all, it changed the borders of Quebec, bringing them down to the Ohio River. So Canada's kind of encroaching into the previous British colonies. The other thing that the Quebec Act did, now this is 10 years after, this is 1774, so this is 10 years after Canada has become a British controlled region. The other thing that the Quebec Act did was to remove references to the Protestant faith from the Oath of Allegiance. Meaning now you could still be Catholic and become a governmental official in Quebec. And then finally, the Quebec Act allowed the free practice of Catholics in Quebec. Protestants in the lower colonies are concerned that what's going on here is an attempt to legitimate Catholicism. And so there's a lot of concern here that some of those still nascent fears of Catholic control of England are still possible. And so they see this as you're giving rights and powers to Catholics, you're changing the colonial government, this is further restricting our freedoms. And so this is one of the reasons why you have this growing unrest. That the Quebec Act, along with the Stamp Act and some of the other intolerable acts, lead to the Revolution.